As the sun slowly descended on Europe's Neolithic period, the stage was set for the rise of various cultures that would come to shape the continent. None can be said to have played a role quite like those that emerged on the fertile banks of the Mediterranean Sea. But it wasn't the Greeks or Romans who ushered in Europe's first civilizations. Instead, it was an illustrious and mysterious culture that emerged on the island of Crete. Nestled comfortably in the southern part of the Aegean Sea, a body of water that separates Greece from Turkey, the land of Crete extends for an impressive 160 miles from east to west. Here, amongst its coastal plains, scenic beaches, and mountains that appear to drop directly into the sea, a culture known as the Minoans arose over 5,000 years ago, and these people would go on to shape history on the continent. Often referred to as not only Europe's first civilization, but the continent's first illiterate society. Their strategic location on the island, wedged between southern Europe, western Asia, and North Africa, allowed them to dominate ancient maritime trade routes, and by the height of their civilization, they were regarded as awe-inspiring masters of the ocean. But who were these mysterious people, and how did they spread their influence and culture across the Mediterranean from such a small island? Aspects of Minoan history still remain somewhat shrouded in mystery. Nonetheless, the dedicated efforts of archaeologists and researchers who have toiled away in the ancient dirt of Crete have shed light on the culture. Professor Nicholas Platon, with his insightful work, elegantly divided Minoan history into 4 periods, developing a chronology based on the destruction and reconstruction of Minoan palaces. He divided the Minoan Crete into 4 distinct periods: the pre-palatial, proto-palatial, neo-palatial, and post-palatial. Archaeologists have surmised that nomadic adventurers, fishermen, and those blown off course by the strong currents of the Mediterranean Sea had established themselves on the shores of Crete by around 7000 BC. During this era, farmers from Anatolia established settlements, and the population could increase drastically over the next few millennia. By the pre-palatial era, starting in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, archaeologists noted the appearance of the first painted ceramics, and settlements began to expand in both size and complexity. Several minor settlements have been discovered near the coast, and we see the beginning of the use of tholos tombs to bury their dead. Tholos tombs are characterized by their circular, beehive-like shape, created by corbelling, superposing successively smaller rings of stones. These early Minoans became masters of their environment, utilizing the potter's wheel and metallurgy to elevate productivity and efficiency on the island. The domestication of animals, including cows, sheep, and pigs, provided them with a sustainable source of sustenance in the form of protein-rich meat, dairy, and milk, while also providing the raw materials for textiles. The vast majority of the early Minoans lived on the eastern half of the island, as this is where the best land for farming was located. But here, they also found a plethora of trees, from which they could craft boats. In time, the ships they would go on to produce were marvels of ancient engineering, designed for both agility and strength on the open waters. They cut down sturdy cypress trees and split the trunks in 2 using bronze tools. From here, they meticulously worked the 2 halves to form the hull, then proceeded to make a waterproof ceiling composed of layers of fabric dipped in a mixture of resin and beef fat. The ships were notable for their slender shape and long, narrow design, optimized for speed and maneuverability, making use of multiple oars as they sailed before the banks of their sacred island. Using these boats, they began sailing along the coast, increasing their seafaring expertise with each trip. Eventually, their knowledge of the ocean, coupled with their bravery, allowed them to venture beyond the shores of Crete and establish contact with various prominent regions on the Mediterranean by 2500 BC, including the Aegean Islands, Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. Minoan merchants exported a plethora of products, including wool, herbs, cloth, wine, and luxury crafts, whilst importing precious stones, ivory, and precious metals such as gold and silver in return. But what they prized above all else was tin and copper, 2 metals that were required to construct the bronze tools needed for various aspects of their daily lives. By the tail end of the pre-palatial period, the Minoans had established major settlements at Myrtos and Moklos. As the Minoan economy continued to flourish, this brought the culture together, allowing for intellectual advancements. This led to the development of a cryptic hieroglyphic system used for writing that was in use by the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, and likely much earlier. Used for administrative and religious purposes, the complex inscriptions appeared on objects like clay tablets, ritual items, pottery, and seals. At this point in time, the economy of Crete was booming, primarily due to its ever-increasing trade with nearby cultures along the Mediterranean. We see the construction of larger homes for the emerging social classes, such as merchants, priestesses, and the wealthy. Minoan society was a shining example of an egalitarian culture based on the abundance of the land's natural resources and on intense commercial activity. They had no powerful landlords, nor a centralized authority. The burial practices of the era support the absence of a hierarchical structure, as entire villages or clans utilized the tholos tombs, and older corpses and offerings were placed aside to make room for a new burial. Older bones were removed from the tomb and placed outside the tholos structure in bone chambers. As their settlements continued to grow in size, adding more homes and even large workspaces and warehouses, they eventually merged into large palace complexes. This is the beginning of the proto-palatial, or First Palace period, in 1900 BC. The first signs of a new political system started to appear during this era, one that would see the establishment of a more centralized society, quite possibly formed around a central figure, like a king. The growing settlements had morphed into bustling palaces, which served as centers for the respective communities. With the ever-increasing influence came the necessity of a more bureaucratic administration, which only further permeated Minoan society henceforth. At this time, we also see the first distinctions made between social classes, which divided the Minoans into nobles, peasants, and perhaps even slaves. With their newfound level of influence over the Mediterranean, the Minoans established permanent settlements on the Cyclades, Thera, Rhodes, Milos, and Kythera islands of the Aegean Sea. Merchants established regular trade with Cyprus, where they sourced valuable quantities of copper. They also expanded their traditional trade routes, venturing deep into Mesopotamia, where they imported goods from the Amorite kingdoms of Babylon, Katna, and Yamad. However, the dynastic Egyptians emerged as the Minoans' most valuable trading partner, where they acquired vast amounts of gold that could be traded at higher prices throughout their trade network, resulting in a greater profit. Extensive road networks were also created in their homeland of Crete, which enabled the Minoans to connect their various cultural centers. Such advancements additionally led to the establishment of smaller settlements away from the palace. As their bustling civilization continued to grow, the Minoans implemented the use of a new written script known as Linear A by modern archaeologists. This simpler form of writing may have been introduced for administrative and economic purposes, recording trade transactions, personal information, and inventories. However, as the script had yet to be fully deciphered, its original purpose remains somewhat unknown. The Minoans had fully emerged as one of the most prosperous civilizations in the world by the end of the Pro-Palatial period, and their reach and influence were felt across the Mediterranean. But then, something unexpected happened. As around 1700 BC, many of their grand palaces and settlements were destroyed. Researchers propose that an enormous earthquake rocked the island, bringing unprecedented destruction and death in its wake. However, while such an event would have destroyed many societies, the Minoans emerged from this cataclysmic event and began to rebuild their civilization, brick by brick. This brings us to the Neopalatial period. During this era, many of their settlements were rebuilt on a colossal scale. and we see the emergence of the most elaborate and sophisticated palaces yet, at places including Malea, Phaistos, and the most famous of all, Knossos. The latter was truly an architectural masterpiece, with the main building covering an area of 3 acres and almost 6 acres when all of the surrounding buildings were included. The main palace was constructed on a fountain of stone and timber beams. The bulk of the structure was built using unbaked bricks. It's thought the structure contained as many as 1,300 rooms. On the ground floor, there was an enormous ritual center, whereas in the central area, a monumental staircase led residents from the ground floor to various staterooms situated on the upper floor. Stores in the palace occupied as many as 16 rooms, with the main feature being the pithoi, or large storage vessels, often reaching 5 feet in height. These were mainly used for goods, such as wool, wine, oil, and grain. Throughout the palace, various bathrooms and toilets were found, each linked by an advanced drainage system far beyond its time. The complex even boasted a large theater, suggesting it was truly a communal space for the entire community. Within these luxurious palaces, we find evidence of the vibrant art produced by the Minoans. Frescoes were elegantly painted on the walls, ceilings, and even floors of their structures, depicting a plethora of scenes from nature, rituals, and everyday life. Some portrayed magical gardens, others monkeys and wild goats. Many even included depictions of fancifully dressed goddesses that testify to the Minoans' predominantly matriarchal religion. However, 2 recurring motifs appeared more often than the others. One was the snake, which was associated with the female goddess, and the other was the bull, usually shown leaping through the air. Such an exquisite example can be found in the upper story portion of the east wall in the Palace of Knossos, which depicts the acrobatic sport that was considered highly sacred by the Minoans. Their sophisticated art was further portrayed on elaborate seals and pottery, such as the famous kamares ware, a distinctive style of Minoan pottery produced by the Minoans in Crete. Characterized by its light-on-dark style of decoration, these often bore enigmatic, geometric, and natural floral patterns. Some of the pottery even depicts women in various poses, elaborately dressed in long dresses and flounced skirts with puffed sleeves, showcasing the fashion of the era. Men, on the other hand, were depicted with dark hair and reddish-brown skin in many of the paintings. Generally, they were clean-shaven, wore loincloths accompanied by belts, and often carried small knives or swords. During the Neo-Palatial period, we see evidence of administrative and economic unity throughout the entire island of Minoan Crete, and its civilization had reached its zenith. Their culture not only dominated the Aegean island, but also left an indelible mark on lands throughout the Mediterranean. But just as it rose to its greatest height, another culture was emerging on the Greek mainland. Legends and tales from the classical Greek era speak of a grand and powerful civilization that once ruled the entirety of the mainland in ancient times. The resounding echoes of philosophers and historians from a time long gone emanate from the decrepit manuscripts of old, narrating a golden age of heroes, opulent palaces, and mighty kings who laid the foundations for the later classical Greek era to flourish. This is the rise of the Mycenaeans. In the epics of the renowned classical Greek writer Homer, he spoke of a powerful civilization of early Greeks who lived many centuries before his time, which he collectively referred to as the Achaeans, Danans, or Argives. To the powerful Hittite civilization, they were the Achaea, but to modern historians, they are simply referred to as the Mycenaeans, a name taken from one of the most powerful city-states of the culture, Mycenae. This palace citadel complex was located in Argolis, in the northeastern Peloponnese. Archaeologists propose that the Mycenaeans rose to prominence sometime around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. Their rise to power across the Aegean coincides with several natural calamities that befell the older and more advanced Minoan culture. As those on Crete grappled with significant setbacks due to cataclysmic events, their neighbors on the mainland reveled in the opportunity to usurp what the Minoan built over centuries, and started to exert their influence over their former rivals. However, according to numerous archaeologists and researchers, the Mycenaean civilization had a humble beginning, being heavily influenced by the Minoans. Aspects of Mycenaean art, architecture, palace-based living, religion, writing, trade, and metalworking all appear to have been influenced by the Minoans. Some have even gone as far as to claim the influence of the Minoans ultimately led to the emergence of the Mycenaean civilization. Unlike the earlier Minoans, the Mycenaeans spoke a form of Proto-Greek, a trait shared with several other cultures on the mainland. However, their society was markedly different. While early Minoan culture seemed to be devoid of war to some degree, the Mycenaeans' entire culture was built on a military aristocracy. Despite this, they were not a unified state under one ruler. Instead, they were a collection of loosely related, independent kingdoms or city-states scattered across the Greek mainland. Most of the individual dynasties were centered around a fortified palace complex. Some of the most powerful settlements of the era included Pylos to the south, Gloa, located north of Mycenae, Tiryns to its south, and smaller regions like Thebes and Athens, the latter of which would become a major settlement by the classical era. Mycenaean society was structured hierarchically, with a king known as the Wanax at the top of each city-state. The Wanax was a central figure of Mycenaean society, deeply involved in all aspects of culture, from religious matters to the micromanagement of the economy and all military actions. The Wanax also owned as much as 3/4 of all the land held by the city-state. Below the king on the hierarchical ladder was the Lauagetas, or the leader of the people. This individual was also considered a religious leader and often served in a general-like position in the military. Like many other Indo-European and Mediterranean cultures, an entourage of noble warriors, well-trained in chariot warfare, was at the heart of the culture. They were known as eketa, which translates to followers or companions. The everyday soldiers were called the lawas, simply translating to people. They bore iconic shields, shaped like a figure eight, accompanied by long spears and bronze swords that made them formidable foes on the battlefield, all sponsored by the state-run armory. The bulk of the eketa and those who filled bureaucratic roles would have lived within the walls of one of the central palace complexes, such as that found in Mycenae. The palace was constructed high on the summit of a large hill, with a commanding view of the Mycenae landscape. Throughout southern Greece, many of the Mycenaean palaces showcase similar architecture. All had a megaron, or throne room, the center of power and authority, which contained a raised central hearth, carefully positioned below an opening in the roof. A royal throne was often placed against a central wall just to the side of the hearth, allowing the Wanax throne to observe those who approached the entrance. Meticulously painted frescoes often covered the walls, and sometimes the floor, portraying images of depicted battles, warriors hunting animals, and religious processions. Inside the palace, key industries, including the manufacturing of goods and weapons, olive oil, textiles, and perfume, were all carefully managed. The Mycenaeans were extremely particular when it came to records, and made use of a script known today as Linear B. This is another aspect of their culture that was adopted from the older Minoan alphabet, Linear A, which allowed the Mycenaeans to write down information in their native Greek tongue. They did so on clay tablets that, when deciphered, mainly focused on economic activities and administrative records of what went on within the palaces, including inventories of goods, workforce organization, and religious offerings. Like the Minoans of Crete, the Mycenaeans used ships, primarily for military and trade purposes. Their expertise in the Aegean Sea and proficiency in sailing would eventually set them up to become the most dominant culture in the region. However, the Minoan civilization would first have to face its demise, and it did. Sometime around 1600 BC, the Minoan colony and trading center of Thera, known today as Santorini, bore witness to one of the largest volcanic eruptions in ancient times. The entire island was devastated, and shockwaves of the cataclysmic event sent enormous tsunamis hurling toward coastal settlements on the Minoan mainland of Crete. Their fleets were decimated, and entire structures were washed out to sea. The carnage would have been unlike anything the Minoan ever witnessed, and this significantly weakened their civilization. But as determined people, they once again started to rebuild from the ground up. Only this time, their Mycenaean neighbors on the mainland had risen to prominence with a naval fleet of their own. In the centuries that followed, the Mycenaeans slowly conquered the Minoan islands throughout the Aegean, one by one in a likely prolonged war. With this, the Mycenaeans began to take control of the major trade routes that the Minoans had carefully created and managed for over a millennium. Still in control of their native homeland, the Minoans on Crete faced yet another devastating event when several enormous earthquakes rocked their island. Thousands perished in the wreckage, and the partially rebuilt ruins were once again turned to rubble. As the Minoans grappled with their dwindling population and the destruction across their island, the Mycenaeans used this time to further exert their control over the Aegean, which was evident by the spread of their pottery, art, architecture, religion, and weapons. With the greatly weakened Minoan culture facing upheaval as they struggled to rebuild their major settlements following the natural disasters, the Mycenaeans saw their chance. Some historians propose that a large-scale invasion of Crete took place around 1450 BC, a strategic move by the Mycenaeans to take advantage of the Minoans' weakened state. As Mycenaean ships arrived on Crete, their military prowess enabled them to take control of the island quickly. No doubt the Minoans put up a fight despite the ruined state of their civilization. However, as the Aketa and Laos cut through the resistance using their long spears in what would have been a prolonged conflict, one by one the great Minoan settlements fell. During this period, the remains of Minoan palaces at Malea, Zakros, and Phaistos were reduced to rubble. Gnosis also faced the wrath of the Mycenaean armies, having first destroyed the sacred Minoan palace before rebuilding it in their own image and establishing a Mycenaean ruling class to govern over the land. The early Greek spoken by the Mycenaeans became the administrative language of Crete, and the material culture shows parallels with mainland styles, which is evident in the architecture of tombs and pottery styles. The names of various Greek deities, such as Zeus, began to appear in tablets written in Linear B, and various distinct pottery shapes emerge on Crete, also providing us with further evidence that the Mycenaeans had successfully brought the native homeland of the Minoans under their command. Crete was relegated to a collection of second-rate Mycenaean states in the wake of the Mycenaean rise to power. The complete and undeniable subjection of the Minoans by the Mycenaeans appears to have been completed by around 1400 BC. For over 2,000 years, this brilliant civilization on Crete had elevated culture throughout the Aegean, but their time at the top ended abruptly, and now they would be forced to serve their new Mycenaean masters. As the sun's luminous rays slowly descend upon the lush fields, rocky valleys, and coastal settlements of Crete, at the end of the Bronze Age, a new era is ushered in. The Minoans, whose enduring legacy still echoes through the annals of history, no longer held the reins of power. Instead, they were relegated to an inferior status and forced to swear allegiance to the Mycenaeans, who now governed their homeland. With the destruction of Gnosis, the power of the Aegean was now centered at Mycenae. This shift in power marked the transition from the new palatial to the post-palatial period, the latter lasting from around 1400 to 1150 BC. As the old saying goes, nothing lasts forever, and like the Minoans had faced many times before, a downfall was on the horizon. But this time, there was no coming back. From this point forward, the mainland Greek city-states controlled the Aegean trade routes and would go on to form valuable relationships with the Egyptians, Syrians, Hittites, and Mitanni, among others. The Minoans, or more so, what was left of their once great population, were now forced to live under the cultural and political influence of a culture they had helped kickstart all those centuries ago. While the Minoans undoubtedly played a significant role in daily life on Crete and throughout the Aegean, they were now subject to Mycenaean authority. Gnosis and Phaistos remained active centers of influence on the island. Western Crete saw a period of prosperity during this age, with several important settlements developing around Castelli and Hania. However, with the ever-increasing Mycenaean influence, Minoan culture was gradually replaced by that of the mainland. This is evident in religious beliefs, which began to exhibit strong influence from that of the Mycenaeans of the Peloponnese. When compared to the vast centralized kingdoms of the East, including the Babylonians, Elamites, Egyptians, and the Mitanni, the Mycenaeans remained a loose confederation of several large city-states centered at 4 or 5 major palaces. From time to time, fighting between the various factions broke out, ultimately weakening the overall strength of the Confederacy. Such squabbling likely played a role in their eventual demise, as, unlike the Minoans, they would not form a civilization that would last through several millennia. Despite their dominance over the Peloponnese, the Mycenaean kingdoms struggled to remain on good terms with one another, and a new threat arose to the east, one that would have long-lasting effects on their civilization. By the 13th century, localized rivalries led to several internal rebellions, and pirates from coastal settlements along the Mediterranean led to the fracturing of their power. Overwhelmed by the raiding, many of the palaces on Crete, such as Gnosis, were destroyed once again. Those who survived the raids and destruction turned to the hills, where they constructed fortified hilltop settlements, showcasing the turbulent nature of the time. Around 1350 BC, the palace at Gnosis was once again destroyed, and this time it was not rebuilt immediately. In recent years, archaeologists have noted that the building was ravaged by a fire, which triggered the collapse of the upper stories. It is not known whether this final destruction was intentional or the result of a natural disaster, such as an earthquake. One intriguing aspect of this period, often noted by historians, is the enigmatic arrival of the Sea Peoples. Many natives from the Aegean, including Minoans and Mycenaeans, as well as others from coastal Anatolia, joined the sea marauders that brought destruction to the banks of the Aegean. Together, they moved east, raising settlements throughout the known world. This confederation, known as the Sea People, eventually met their match in Egypt, where they were defeated in a great battle by the reverend Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III. Some of those captured during this time, known as the Peliset, were forced to emigrate to the Levant, forming a colony known as Philistia, and its people, the Philistines. Archaeologists and historians largely agree that the Peliset's origins can be traced back to the Aegean Sea. A prevailing theory is that their genetic ancestry is an amalgamation of several groups, including the Minoans and Mycenaeans of Crete. With the decline of the Mycenaean power throughout the Peloponnese, and even on Crete, this vacuum allowed for the emergence of a new people to take control, and emerging far to the north were the Dorians. The Dorians were a branch of Greek-speaking people whose traditional homelands are thought to have been somewhere around the mountainous regions of Macedonia and Epirus. By around 1150 BC, it was thought that the southern part of mainland Greece was entirely under their control. They established themselves in various regions of the Peloponnese, including Laconia, where the infamous city of Sparta would later emerge. Their influence during this period is felt across the entire heartland of Mycenaean culture, with the Dorian dialect of Greek becoming widespread. A strong communal bond and the separation of sexes characterized Doric social structure. Free men were heavily involved in the military campaigns, often spending a considerable amount of their younger lives away from home, fighting on behalf of the kingdom. Women, on the other hand, had a lot of freedom and considerable economic power compared to women from other Greek ethnicities. Unlike other Hellenic cultures, Dorian women were permitted to own property, manage their husbands' estates, and even delegate many domestic tasks to slaves. Dorian women also continued to don the traditional peplos, a tunic that was once common to all Hellenese. This form of clothing was pinned at the shoulders by stylish brooches and had several slits which bared the thighs, permitting a greater deal of movement than the chiton, a long tunic-like garment. By 1100 BC, the Dorians arrived on the banks of the island of Crete, taking over from the Mycenaeans and ushering in a new age of authoritarian rule for the last remaining native Minoans. This period marks the assimilation of the last remaining elements of native Minoan culture into the new Hellenic culture, a transition that was profound and far-reaching. Under Doric dominance, Crete transformed from a monarchy to an aristocracy, yet several aspects of Minoan traditions remained somewhat influential, such as their legal system. The Spartan legislator Lycurgos extensively studied the Cretan laws before creating his own legislation that would later govern the Lacedaemonian state. During the height of Doric Crete, Knossos, Arcades, Driros, Gortyn, Leto, and Lyctos became the most important centers of the island, and many continued to benefit from the trade networks first established by the Minoans as they exported and imported goods with Cyprus, Syria, and the Aegean. The rise of Dorian society not only marks a dramatic change in Peloponnese and Cretan politics, but also the transition from the end of the Bronze Age to the Dark Ages. While this sounds rather pessimistic, in reality, it's more accurate to suggest the Dorians simply brought a period of instability to the region, rather than being the driving force behind the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. The reality is that the latter had already been in decline, but it wasn't all negative. As the first millennium BC rolled in, Doric culture brought various contributions that would survive through to the much later classical Greek world. Strong, unadorned columns, evident in sites such as the Parthenon, the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, and the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, characterized Doric architecture. The Doric dialect also influenced the development of language in many of the regions in which they settled. New technologies also emerged during the height of Doric society, such as the arrival of ironworking and the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet that would later form the basis of the Greek script. The awe-inspiring epics of Homer, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, are also believed to have been composed during the Dark Ages, reflecting the values and traditions of this period. However, their invasion of the mainland and Crete ultimately led to a period of decline in trade, population, and increased isolation between groups. The large centralized Mycenaean city-states gave way to smaller, independent communities, or polis, often ruled by chieftains or heads of families. In time, the once prosperous cultures that had laid the foundations of civilization throughout the Aegean Sea had morphed into nothing more than fairy tales and legends. The Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, which had previously ushered in an age of social evolution, were no more. However, the amalgamation of the Doric society with that of its predecessors would eventually lead to the emergence of classical Greek civilization, a culture that would go on to help shape the modern world. As the inauspicious shadow that engulfed the cultures of the Aegean Sea during the Dark Ages began to dissipate, a light began to emerge over Hellas, one that would usher in a new age of culture and innovation in ancient Greece. The civilization of the Minoans and Mycenaeans had long vanished, and with their disappearance, it could have marked the end of prosperity in this part of the world. Fortunately, this was not meant to be, and the Greeks would go on to influence Western society in many ways. The end of the Dark Ages along the banks of the Aegean and Peloponnese is marked by a transition into the Archaic era, lasting from around 800 to 500 BCE. During this time, there were 4 major Greek-speaking peoples, sometimes referred to as tribes: the Aeolians, the Ionians, the Achaeans, and of course, the Dorians. The Aeolians, known for their poetic influence in ancient times, primarily lived in Aeolis, a coastal region in Asia Minor, and on Lesbos, an island located in the Aegean. The Ionians, looked upon as the innovators and philosophers of Hellas, prospered in the region of Ionia, located on the western coast of Anatolia. In contrast, the Achaeans, who claimed descent from the ancient Mycenaean kings, primarily inhabited the area of Achaea in the northern Peloponnese. Lastly, we have the Dorians, known for their militaristic culture and disciplined society, controlled a vast swath of territory in the southern and eastern Peloponnese, including notable regions such as Laconia, Messenia, Argolis, and the Isthmus of Corinth, as well as some Aegean islands like Milos, Thera, Rhodes, Kos, and even parts of Crete. These 4 tribes are often credited as the progenitors of what would eventually go on to shape ancient Greek culture and identity, setting the stage for the classical period that would follow. Despite each of these diverse cultures sharing a common linguistic heritage, alongside genetic similarities and religious beliefs, ancient Greece was not a single unified nation or kingdom. Instead, it was a mosaic of diverse cultures, each contributing in its own way to the development of Hellenic civilization. Archaeologists generally agree that 2 major trends were taking place within Greek society. The first was the widespread adoption of the Phoenician alphabet, a pivotal development that the Greeks modified and used for writing. This adaptation allowed the Greek poet Homer to compile the iconic epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, into a standardized version. These oral traditions, now committed to paper, could be easily distributed throughout the Greek world, providing the distinct tribes with a common mythological story centered on their gods. But more importantly, it offered the ancient Greeks a connection to their heroic past, and brought about a shared sense of identity amongst the various tribes throughout the Hellenistic world. A typical Greek polis typically comprised a sizable urban center, built around a town, and often encompassed the countryside. In specific terms, it was the center of politics for the state, and from it arose the first notions of legal citizenship, equality, voting on laws. Essentially, it was the founding of democracy as we know it. However, not all polis were created equal. Many differed in their political structure, social norms, and even which goods they favored. For instance, the Ionian city of Athens, perched high on a coastal plain looking out to the Aegean Sea, is known for its democracy and a strong focus on art and education. In Athens, male landowning citizens had a say in government and were permitted to attend councils and assemblies where vital decisions would be made, showcasing its pioneering democratic system. Whereas Sparta, founded by a Dorian tribe, prioritized military strength and a strict social structure. This iconic city-state was under the command of a council of elders, often looked upon as a form of an oligarchy. But some, like the city of Corinth, were ruled over by tyrants from the Doric Bacchiadae tribe. While many of these settlements may have originated in earlier times, they underwent a process known as synoikismos, which means smaller settlements merged into a larger polis, greatly contributing to its size and prosperity. In some Greek polis, citizens were permitted to gather in the agora, an open area often used as a market and public square, where they would discuss matters important to the city as a whole. However, for the most part, Greek society across the board was primarily patriarchal. meaning men held all positions of political power. The wealthiest members of society became known as the aristocrats, which literally translates to the best people. Free citizens could vote during elections and on new laws, which were often drawn up by a group of elders known as archons. But even in the cities where citizens didn't vote on laws, there was a strong sense of community that helped unify the polis. From this, the concept of civic virtue arose, which proposed that the highest form of morality was to place the betterment of the community above your own selfish desires. As for women in Greek society, they were not subject to a terrible existence, despite their inability to hold public office. It's evident that during the Archaic period, women had a level of social influence, as well as access to economic power. For example, women could inherit property, and often received social approval for the skillful management of households. Looking at the Greek polis as a whole, numerous distinct and independent cities arose during the Archaic period, each fiercely proud of its own identity and independence. Sometimes, small-scale wars would break out against one another. However, others unified themselves into confederacies, such as the Aeolian cities of Syme, Larissa, and Smyrna, among others. Sometime in the 7th century BC, the Aeolians established the Dodecapolis, or League of 12 Cities, in Aeolis, a region along the western coast of Asia Minor. While remaining independent city-states, they often came to each other's aid during times of war. This was possible because even though distinct in many ways, the polis recognized the differing city-states as fellow Greeks, and therefore as cultural equals. The four main branches of Greek tribes all spoke mutually intelligible dialects of the Greek language, and they worshipped the same pantheon of gods. Ties between the various cities were all strengthened by the invention of institutions, such as the Pan-Hellenic Games, or the Games of all Greece. This was a way in which the varying polis across the Peloponnese, Aegean, and far-off colonies could come together to celebrate their shared culture. The games were a combination of religious festivals and competitions, in which aristocrats from each city competed in various sports, including javelin, discus, foot races, and a brutal form of unarmed combat called pankration. The most famous of all of these was the Olympics, an event named after the site of Olympia, located in southern Greece. While legends propose the games were founded by the gods Heracles or Pelops, historical evidence suggests it was first started by the Dorian city-state of Elis, sometime around 776 BCE. It would go on to last for over 1,000 years, and many use the beginning of the games as a milestone to mark the transition between the Dark Ages and the Archaic period of Greek civilization. The games were extraordinary for many reasons, including their longevity. Greeks throughout the world would travel long distances to attend the Olympics, often traveling from as far away as the Black Sea and Sicily. Wars were temporarily suspended, and all polis issued a ceasefire or truce that permitted athletes to travel safely to attend the games. The introduction of Pan-Hellenic games and the emergence of stronger societies throughout the Greek world also allowed trade to flourish once again, just as it had during the height of the Minoan or Mycenaean civilizations. Greek colonies appeared as far away as Spain and North Africa, and the seafarers set up trading posts in the areas they settled, including Egypt. Here, they took advantage of the fertile lands, which allowed them to grow olives and grapes for oil and wine. Merchants eagerly traded with many cultures, including the Egyptians, Babylonians, and Celts of Western Europe, who were particularly fond of Greek wine. Their influence during this period could not be overstated, as evidenced by the Roman general Julius Caesar. During his conquest of Gaul, or modern France, he recorded the Celts writing their native tongue in the Greek alphabet. It had truly become a new era of prosperity for the tribes of Greece, as they continued to evolve their political institutions and culture, whilst colonizing and trading with cultures across the Mediterranean and beyond. All of this would lead this enigmatic civilization into a golden age, due to its significant cultural, intellectual, and artistic achievements. However, with such affluence came unforeseen consequences. And for these Greeks, a new enemy would soon arrive at the walls of their fabled cities from the east, with a desire to subjugate the proud tribes and city-states of Hellas. A new era of prosperity began to permeate throughout the Greek world during the 6th century BC, as the city-states flourished and continued to expand their influence throughout the Mediterranean Sea. But for the resilient Hellens, who had freed themselves from the degenerative grasp of the Dark Age, a new challenge awaited them, one that pushed their newfound civilization to its limits. The proud Ionians, who had long settled along the coastal regions of Asia Minor, constructed renowned cities such as Miletus, Colophon, and Ephesus, and they prospered in this part of the world. Unlike the militaristic and rigid Dorians and other Greek tribes, the Ionians preferred to focus on the nature of the universe, seeking answers to questions that went beyond the mundane existence of soldiers and farmers. It was amongst these tribes and their various dynasties that philosophy was born, with the pioneering efforts of figures such as Thales of Miletus and Anaximander. These prominent figures embarked on a conscious journey to understand the nature of existence, the cosmos, and human life, laying the foundations for scientific thought that would move beyond mythical explanations and into an era of rational interpretations of the world. But just as they were about to enter into a golden age, an enemy to the east sought to pull them back into darkness. Around 540 BC, the infamous king of the newly formed Achaemenid or Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great, sought to exert power over neighboring kingdoms and city-states. From his homeland in modern-day Iran, he sent out highly organized and motivated forces to conquer Babylon, Lydia, and the Ionian city-states located across Asia Minor. In the decades that followed, the polis of the Ionian tribes were subjugated and forced to live under native tyrants, who were nominated by the Persian officials residing in Sardis, the capital of Lydia. Decades of hardship eventually resulted in the Great Ionian Revolt at the beginning of the 5th century BC. This was a time when the Greek tribes, despite their differences, came together in a show of unity and solidarity. The revolt began after Aristotle, the tyrant leader of Miletus, was dismissed by the Persian overlords, following a disastrous expedition. Enraged by the decision, Aristotle decided to take revenge by uniting all the Greek tribes across Asia Minor into a full-blown rebellion against the Persian Empire. This event marked the start of the Greco-Persian Wars, which would result in wide-scale bloodshed for almost 5 decades. As the revolt raged on, it drew more regions of Asia Minor into the conflict. Eventually, Aristotle managed to secure military support from Eretria and Athens, and in 498 BC, their combined forces invaded and destroyed the Persian regional capital of Sardis, razing the settlement to the ground. Noting the role the Athenians and Eretrians played in the conflict, King Darius, who had succeeded his father, Cyrus, vowed to take revenge on these city-states. However, the might of the Greek Confederacy would prove too strong for the Persian leader after he organized a full-scale invasion of Greece, culminating in the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. On a low-lying coastal plain, flanked by sand dunes and beaches, The mighty soldiers of the Achaemenid Empire, under the command of the Persian generals Datis and Artaphernes, arrived at Marathon, just north of Athens. Here, they met the combined forces of the Athenians and allies from Plataea. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Athenian forces, led by Miltiades, showcased their military prowess and successfully defeated the Persian army. Forced to pull the remainder of his forces back towards Persia, Darius once again promised to return and make the Athenians pay. But he would die shortly after, and his son Xerxes took over the empire and began preparing for an extensive campaign against the Greek city-states. By 480 BC, he arrived in Greece with one of the largest armies ever assembled. His forces overcame a small Greek army led by King Leonidas of Sparta at the Battle of Thermopylae. The Persians proceeded to invade Athens and even managed to burn the city to the ground, destroying the sacred Acropolis and other structures during the event. However, the Athenians had evacuated the city before the Persian army arrived. But despite early success, the Persians would again face defeat at the hands of their enemies during the Battle of Salamis. This naval battle, fought in the straits between the island of Salamis and the Greek mainland, was a turning point in the war. The Greek navy, led by Themistocles, fought courageously, forcing Xerxes and his forces to retreat. Undeterred by the loss, Xerxes mustered his forces once again and prepared for one of the largest battles of the Greco-Persian War. In 479 BC, a coalition of Greek city-states, including Sparta, Athens, Corinth, and Megara, faced the might of the Achaemenid Empire. Near the city of Plataea, in Boeotia, a combined Greek army of around 200,000 men, led by the Spartan general Pausanias, faced the Persian army head-on and successfully defeated them, slaying the noble Achaemenid general Mardonius in the process. This decisive victory led to the retreat of Persian forces and ultimately brought the second invasion of Greece to an end. Following this pivotal victory, the city-states of Ionia regained their independence, but the war wasn't over yet. In 478, the Delian League was founded by a coalition of around 200 city-states as an anti-Persian alliance that fell under Athenian leadership. It continued campaigning against the Achaemenid Empire for the next 3 decades, seeking to expel the last remaining influence the Persians had in Europe. Historians generally agree that by 449 BC, the Greco-Persian War came to a quiet end after the signing of a peace treaty in Callias, which secured complete independence for all Greek city-states, allowing for the flourishing of culture throughout the Hellenic world. The valiant effort on behalf of the Greek Confederacy demonstrated their ability to unify against a common enemy for the betterment of the wider Hellenic civilization, and fostered a shared sense of national identity amongst the apparently distinct city-states. The culmination of this war with the Persians allowed the Greek tribes to enter into a golden age, characterized by advancements in art, philosophy, architecture, and political thought that would go on to influence the world for centuries to come. To historians, this period became known as the Classical Era. During this time, the Greek polis were at their most powerful in terms of military and economic power. The period saw a flourishing of Greek culture, particularly in regions such as Athens, which soon became the intellectual and artistic center of Hellenic civilization. Athens was the richest and most influential of all the Greek polis during this period, and democracy blossomed within the walls of their city. The Athenians were soon regarded as pioneers, as their emphasis on free speech allowed for the development of various arts, including drama, philosophy, history, and fields including maths, geography, physics, and botany. Prominent thinkers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle wrote engaging works on philosophy, laying the groundwork for Western thought that continues to invoke lively debates about ethics, the nature of reality, and wisdom. We also see the emergence of some of the world's oldest so-called scientists, in figures like Leucippus and Democritus, who came up with the idea that the elements of the Earth were comprised of tiny particles called atoms that formed everything in the universe. What they had just developed was the beginning of atomic theory that would later sit at the heart of modern chemistry. Numerous other disciplines emerged during this era of enlightenment, such as recorded history, in the sense of a story based on historical events, that tries to explain what happened and why it happened the way it did. The discipline's founding father is a Greek historian by the name of Herodotus, who wrote an extensive history of the Persian War. Along with an increase in academia, the classical period saw an increase in iconic works of art, such as the sculptures of the Doryphoros and Critios boy, known for their idealized human forms and contrapposto stance. But this spread to architecture, where we find almost perfect symmetry in buildings and the use of a specific mathematical concept known as the golden ratio, which the Hellenes believed was inherently appeasing when observed. One prominent surviving piece of architecture that showcases this sacred mathematical code is the Parthenon of Athens, dedicated to the patron goddess of the city, Athena. The monument was built to embody the golden ratio in terms of its height and width, likewise in the use of its symmetrical columns and beautiful carvings. It is widely believed to strike a perfect balance between elegance and grandeur. Athens continued to prosper as a city-state, and the tides of fortune propelled the city to unprecedented heights. The Athenians remained at the head of the Delian League, and in time, the city-state eventually morphed this alliance into an empire, exerting control over the member states and collecting vast tributes, extensively increasing its naval strength and wealth. This expansion greatly alarmed Sparta and its allies, who began viewing Athenian dominance as a direct threat to their autonomy. Tensions continued to rise for decades, and all-out war was only avoided after a treaty known as the 30 Years' Peace was signed in 446 BC, which sought to maintain stability between the two Greek superpowers. But in the end, this couldn't stop the inevitable. When Thebes, an ally of Sparta, attacked Plataea, an ally of Athens, this act marked the official beginning of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC. For over 2 decades, Athens and Sparta engaged in warfare alongside their respective allies. Traditionally, the conflict is divided into 3 phases, the first of which is known as the Archidamian War, named after the Spartan king Archidamus II. During this period, Spartan forces periodically invaded Attica, whereas Athenian forces conducted raids along the Peloponnesian coast. The second phase of the war, known as the Peace of Nicias, occurred from 421 to 412 BC, and was characterized by ongoing skirmishes and political maneuvering, as opposed to peace. The final phase, known as the Decelean War, saw Sparta turn to its former foe, Persia, which helped them build a formidable navy. This resulted in the decisive Battle of Aegispotami in 405 BC, where the Spartan fleet wreaked havoc on the Athenian navy, destroying the vast majority of its ships. A year later, the Athenian leaders surrendered to Sparta, resulting in the loss of their empire. The long-term effects of this conflict had far-reaching consequences for the Hellenic world. Sparta now emerged as the dominant power in Greece, but struggled to maintain control over its newfound empire. Athens struggled with its intense economic hardship and political instability in the decades that followed. Greece was plunged into a period of turmoil and plagued by strife as various city-states fought for power. In the aftermath of the war, Greece was now politically fragmented, socially divided, economically strained, and philosophically challenged, ultimately paving the way for continued conflict among its city-states. But soon, a new power would rise to the north that would eventually lead the Greek city-states into a new era, one that would see their influence stretch across the largest empire the world has ever seen at that point in history. As the ashes of the Peloponnesian War began to settle throughout the heartland of the Hellenic world, the Greek tribes were once again forced to reckon with significant social and political changes that would shape the future of their civilization. While the war led to a decline in civilization as a whole and brought an abrupt end to their golden era, it wasn't quite tumultuous enough to force the Hellenic tribes into another age of darkness. Sparta was now recognized as the leading power throughout the Aegean, whereas, for the once prosperous city of Athens, revered for its democracy and free speech, the devastating losses it suffered at the hands of the Spartans would thrust it into a period of political turmoil, known to historians as the Rule of the 30 Tyrants, beginning in 404 BC. Sparta instilled a brief oligarchic regime over the fabled city, ushering in several years of repression and widespread discontentment among the native Athenians. So much so that the tyrants were quickly overthrown by 403 BC, and democracy was once again restored. However, things would never return to how they were before the war, and tensions between emerging ideas centered on ethics and governance in the city would push the concept of free speech and thought to breaking point. This culminated with the execution of the fabled philosopher Socrates, who was sentenced to death by the state in 399 BC for not believing in the gods of Athens. However, many believe his push to teach students to question traditional beliefs and authority was the true cause of his demise. Nonetheless, a form of democracy continued to flourish in Athens as they slowly regained their autonomy and power. Fueled by resentment of Sparta, Athens, alongside the city-states of Corinth and Thebes, mustered their forces and sought to dismantle the hold Sparta had on the Greek world. This culminated in the Corinthian War, lasting from 395 to 387 BC. Eventually, the bloody conflict met its end with the signing of a treaty known as the Peace of Antalcidas. This saw Persia once again claim dominion over Ionia, while restoring Sparta as the dominant force on mainland Greece, much to the dismay of the Athenian alliance. In the decades that followed the conflict, Thebes continued to rise in power under valiant leaders like Epaminondas. This led the city-state to outright challenge the grip Sparta had on Greece at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, where the Theban forces defeated their enemies in this decisive battle. Following their victory, Thebes enjoyed a short but prosperous reign as the leading city-state, exerting some level of control over the other cities. During this period of instability, a new powerful force was rising far to the north, one that would soon usher in an age for Greece. Beyond the furthest northern borders of the Greek city-states lay the tiny kingdom of Macedon. Throughout most of history, it wasn't looked upon as a threat by the Greek city-states to its south. But this all changed under the guidance of King Philip II, who ascended to the Macedonian throne in 359 BC. Revered as an experienced military leader, strategic thinker, and skilled diplomat, he would play a significant role in transforming his nation from a small kingdom to an extensive empire that would govern over a swath of land stretching from Greece to India. In the decades following his succession to the throne, Philip unified most of Macedonia before turning his attention to Greece, where he sought to expand his influence using a carefully planned campaign of conflict and diplomatic marriages. Due to his expertise as a military strategist, he implemented effective new tactics, such as the phalanx, which gave his forces an impressive advantage on the battlefield. This formation, coupled with the use of the sarissa, a long spear-like weapon, led his army to many victories in Greece as he slowly expanded his territory. His long-term goal was to bring the Hellenic world under Macedonian leadership. This vision became a reality after the decisive Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, where he defeated a coalition of Greek city-states. In the wake of his greatest victory, he established the League of Corinth. This unified the Greek city-states under Macedonia, allowing them to retain a level of autonomy in internal affairs. With such an extensive empire under his command, the world was his oyster. But then, tragedy struck, as sometime in 336 BC, the infamous king was found dead, with rumors suggesting he was poisoned by a member of his own personal bodyguards. After laying his father to rest, a young Alexander III was crowned king of the Macedonian Empire at just 20 years old. While some of the nobility had doubts about his ability, the young leader's charisma and early military success quickly changed their minds. He quickly got to work, consolidating power and securing loyalty from his father's generals. From here, he quelled any rebellions from Greek city-states, which led to the destruction of Thebes. This ruthless act served as a warning to the other Hellenic nations. Alexander's early military success established him as a capable military commander, and soon he began marching his forces beyond the eastern borders of Hellas and into Persian territory. Just like his father, Alexander's military expertise was evident as he earned decisive victories over the Achaemenid Empire, such as the battles of Granicus in 334 BC and Issus in 333 BC. With the Persian Empire on the retreat, he took this as an opportunity to extend his campaigns into Egypt and Syria. After successfully bringing these ancient kingdoms under his command, he constructed several cities, none of which could be considered as famous as Alexandria, perched on the northern banks of the Nile River. As his empire continued to stretch across the Mediterranean Sea, Alexander wasn't yet content and returned his focus to the Persians. This war culminated with the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC. Here, in an ancient village located in modern Iraq, the forces of Alexander successfully defeated those of King Darius III. With his victory, he brought the mighty Achaemenid Empire to an end. Having brought such an extensive empire to its knees, and under the command of his homeland, the young king became known as Alexander the Great to his followers. But he wasn't done just yet. With Persian territory now under his command, Alexander sought to extend his empire even further. His large army now consisted of Macedonians at its core, backed by Greek allies from the League of Corinth, Greek mercenaries, and now even Persian auxiliaries. This allowed the king to march further east, decimating smaller tribes of Afghanistan and bringing the region under his control as he inched toward the prosperous kingdoms located along the Indus River Valley. Despite facing challenges such as troop fatigue and many deaths at the hands of local resistance, Alexander's forces encroached on India, eventually capturing Punjab and Swat in 327 BC. But the following year, King Porus of Punjab mustered a sizable army and faced the Macedonian alliance at the Battle of Hydaspes. While Alexander's army managed to successfully defeat the forces of Porus, his army was left feeling mentally and physically exhausted and on the verge of mutiny. Many of his leading officials spoke on behalf of the soldiers, who demanded they return home to Macedon. At this point, Alexander's soldiers had spent years campaigning, and many were both exhausted and homesick, whereas others grew increasingly concerned about the possibility of defeating the much larger Nanda Empire of northern India. As they looked out over the banks of the Hyphasis River, Alexander may have been initially resistant to retreat, but after careful consideration, he ultimately relented, and so began the long journey back to their homeland. Despite the decision, Alexander the Great had established the largest empire the world had ever seen by the young age of 30. But in the end, he wouldn't live long enough to truly reap the rewards of his extensive efforts. In 323 BC, a mysterious illness fell upon the young king, and despite all the wealth in the world, he could not overcome the sickness. By June 13th, he was pronounced dead. While theories range on what could have led to the king's death, most historians propose it was either typhoid fever or malaria. Strange accounts from historians of the era claim his body refrained from decomposing for almost 6 days, leading many to believe he was some kind of divine being. But such a belief did nothing to stop the chaos that would soon ensue. With the death of the most outstanding military leader of the era, and no immediate successor to take his place, the vast empire of Alexander the Great was thrown into turmoil. This further plunged Greece into chaos, as several anti-Macedonian states, such as Athens, ignited a large-scale rebellion that would shake Greek civilization to its very core. In 323 BC, Alexander the Great lay on his deathbed in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II. A feverish illness overcame his body, leaving him in a severely weakened state. Surrounded by his lieutenants, soldiers, wives, and eunuchs, the valiant leader would take his final breath. With his vast empire stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea to the banks of the Ganges River in India, would be thrown into turmoil and destruction. From its ashes, several powerful kingdoms would emerge, each fighting for control of the known world. This marks the beginning of the Hellenistic period of Greek history. For all Alexander the Great accomplished during his young life, from his extensive conquests to his charismatic leadership and military brilliance, he left an indelible mark on history. But he did make one mistake, whether it was reluctance based on pride or simply avoiding a question for which he did not yet have an answer. Alexander failed to name an heir. His wife, Roxana, was pregnant with their child. Still, he died before she could give birth, setting the stage for a series of power struggles among his generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors, and the eventual fragmentation of the empire. It all began with a momentous event known as the Partition of Babylon, a gathering of Alexander's top commanders within the heart of the ancient city in June 323 BC. As they gathered around a great table, they all engaged in lengthy debates about the future of the empire. In terms of succession, several options were put forward. Would they wait for Roxana's unborn child to be born? Or could they appoint Philip III Aridius, Alexander's half-brother, as king? A third option was also proposed, one that would see the vast expanse of the empire divided among his many generals. The commanders and officials deliberated, and after intense negotiations, they reached a compromise. Aridius would take on the role of king, but if Roxana's child were born a boy, he would serve as co-king. Despite their titles, in reality, both were mere figureheads, as the true power lay in the hands of the generals. The territory Alexander had spent years conquering was divided into satrapies, or provinces, each governed by one of his many generals. Macedonia and Greece would remain under Antipater's control. Egypt fell under the domain of Ptolemy I, and Thrace was handed to Lysimachus. Python governed Media, while Asia Minor was ruled by Antigonus and Leonatus, who took Phrygia and Hellespontine Phrygia, respectively. Philip received Bactria and Sogdiana. Later, Seleucus I was placed in command of Babylonia. The division among the generals was a strategic move to ensure the longevity of the wider empire. However, it would ultimately play a leading role in its disintegration. In essence, the partition of Babylon marked the beginning of the end, as peace among the generals would not last. The human element of personal ambitions led to small conflicts between the generals, each seeking to exert greater control over their territories and surrounding regions. These skirmishes escalated, which shook Alexander's empire to its very core, as the echoes of iron swords clashing reverberated throughout the known world. The ensuing bloodshed crippled the empire's overall strength. The wars lasted from 322 to 281 BC. Despite the generals signing various peace treaties over the 41-year conflict, 3 major dynasties emerged by the culmination of the war. They would go on to found sovereign kingdoms, ultimately marking the end of Alexander the Great's unified empire. On the banks of the Nile River, where the temples of old towered high above the scorched sands of the deserts, Ptolemy laid the foundations of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. Being of Macedonian Greek ancestry, he was a close and trusted ally of Alexander the Great, and served him unequivocally, earning his position as one of the most powerful diadochi. Following Alexander's death, Ptolemy took possession of the remains of his former leader, before transporting them to Alexandria. In time, he interred Alexander's remains in a newly constructed and lavish tomb. Historians have proposed that Ptolemy engaged in this act solely out of self-interest, as it allowed him to legitimize his control over Egypt. During the wars of the Diadochi, the new ruler of Egypt managed to expand his kingdom, bringing Cyprus, Cyrenaica, and Judea under his dominion. During his life, many looked upon Ptolemy as a skilled warrior, but at heart, he was a patron of the arts. Thus, his infamous city, Alexandria, founded as a Greek polis, soon became the epicenter of culture and scholarship, and was recognized as an intellectual hub where many ventured to acquire knowledge and wisdom. Following his death in 283 BC, the reins of power were passed to his son, Ptolemy II, who played a pivotal role in solidifying the Ptolemaic dynasty as an independent kingdom. Ptolemy and his descendants would go on to govern Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Far to the east, an equally powerful kingdom had emerged under the guidance of Seleucus I, starting out his career as a companion of Alexander and one of his most trusted generals. In the wake of the wars of the Diadochi, his empire had taken control of most of Asia Minor and the land along the Fertile Crescent, including Persia and Mesopotamia. During the height of the conflict, Seleucus wrestled Syria from Antigonus, who was considered one of the strongest diadochi. Eventually, his mighty empire, revered for its military prowess, managed to extend its influence to the borders of India. Following the example laid down by Alexander, Seleucus established several important cities, including Antioch on the eastern Mediterranean coast and Seleucia at Tigris. These capital cities would soon become centers of trade for one of the most powerful kingdoms of the Hellenistic world. To the northwest of Seleucus's sprawling empire and north of Ptolemy's kingdom in Egypt lay the Antigonid dynasty, established by Antigonus I Monophthalmus. During Alexander's life, he was a prominent Macedonian general and played a key role in many military campaigns. Often looked upon as the most powerful of the diadochi, he and his son Demetrius took control of the vast majority of Alexander's empire. However, their numerous military triumphs led his rivals, Ptolemy and Seleucus, alongside other generals, to form an alliance. This culminated in the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC. Antigonus and his mighty army sought to invade Egypt, but were bested by the coalition, and he perished in this mighty battle after being struck by a javelin. Following his death, The Antigonus dynasty was gravely weakened, and in the end, their territory was reduced to the lands of Macedon and mainland Greece. The conflicts that erupted during the early Hellenistic period led to an era of instability. However, with the rise of the new political powers, the territories, once under the command of Alexander the Great, did experience a period of prosperity, in which culture and intellectual ideas flourished. Greek ideas spread beyond the borders of its heartland, weaving their way through Persia, Egypt, and as far away as India. This resulted in a combination of Hellenistic culture with local traditions. One significant feature of this syncretism of cultures was the emergence of Koine Greek, a specific form of the language employed as a lingua franca, or common dialect, predominantly in use across the Hellenistic world. As citizens from the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt to the Seleucid Empire of Persia could easily communicate with one another, this facilitated an increase in trade and cultural exchange. This early period also bore witness to various scientific advancements, as scholars in Alexandria became a center of learning. Philosophy saw significant development during this period. Schools of thought like Stoicism flourished under the reign of the Ptolemaic dynasty. While it was founded by Zeno of Citium in Athens sometime around 300 BC, it quickly spread to other Hellenistic cities. Alexandria had a large Greek population, and the city's cosmopolitan feel provided fertile ground for the development of Stoicism. Its core principles were centered on accepting what is out of our control, focusing on inner strength, and finding happiness through virtue rather than external factors. Epicureanism, a separate school of thought, founded in Athens, also spread rapidly during this era. Differing in its core beliefs, it focused on the pursuit of happiness and avoiding pain. It sought to provide wisdom on how to free oneself from fear, instructing practitioners to achieve pleasure through modest and sustainable means. Valuing friendships and seeking knowledge to better understand the world around us also served as an integral part of its philosophy. The increased popularity of these philosophical disciplines reflects a cultural shift occurring throughout the Hellenistic world, one that saw a greater level of focus placed upon individualism and personal ethics, as opposed to civic duty that lay at the heart of earlier Greek thought. But despite the flourishing of culture, the powers that be were not yet satisfied with their territories, and soon the Hellenistic world would be plunged into yet another prolonged and devastating conflict that would have long-lasting consequences for their world. As the warm glow of the Mediterranean sun descended upon the kingdom of the Hellenistic world during the 3rd century BC, a period of stability fell upon its bustling cities, leading to an era of intellectual enlightenment. Figures like Euclid made significant contributions to mathematics. His most influential work, Elements, is a 13-book treatise that laid the foundational groundwork in geometry. Now known as the father figure of geometry, his work dominated the field until the 19th century. Another prominent figure of the era, Aristarchus of Samos, was one of the first humans to propose that the sun actually lies at the center of the solar system, and that planets such as Earth revolve around it. Although largely ignored in antiquity, modern astronomy recognizes his model as an early and accurate conceptualization or idea of the solar system. Advancements in medicine were pioneered by Herophilus, a Greek physician and anatomist who was often regarded as the father of anatomy. He made significant contributions in his field, distinguishing between arteries and veins, while also providing us with early descriptions of the brain. He often went as far as to write about the differences between motor and sensory nerves, all of which would remain prevalent in the study of the human body for centuries to come. In the city of Syracuse, Sicily, the polymath Archimedes pushed the boundaries of human learning, making significant leaps in math, physics, astronomy, and most of all, engineering. Remembered today for several inventions like the Archimedes screw, an intricate yet simple pump employed to raise water. It was utilized in various aspects of Hellenistic life, from removing water to ships potentially playing a role in the irrigation of the infamous Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Art also experienced a period of evolution during this period of cultural innovation. A strong emphasis on realism emerged, and the sculptures of the era began to depict raw human emotions in a manner seldom witnessed before. The enchanting Laocoon and his Sons perfectly encapsulates the development of art, thought to have been meticulously crafted as a bronze sculpture by 3 artists from the Greek island of Rhodes, Hagisandros, Polydoros, and Athenodoros. It contains an intense dramatization of the figures as they fight to free themselves from the grasp of monstrous serpents. As art flourished and enlightenment poured out from the many polis, trade also experienced a newfound level of prosperity. The Mediterranean Sea, Persian Gulf, and Red Sea were alive with the vessels of mariners who transported goods such as olive oil, wine, pottery, and metalwork to far-off lands. Intricate connections were made with prominent cultures such as the Celts of Western Europe, Thracians, Illyrians, Sarmatians, and Scythians, from whom the Hellenistic kingdoms sourced grain, pork, and various items of luxury. One prevalent aspect of this prosperous era was the adoption of standardized coinage. Despite the lack of political unification throughout the Hellenistic world, the Attic standard monetary system gained prominence. Based on the silver drachma, a coin weighing 4.3 grams, first used by the Athenians around the 6th century BC, it became the dominant standard for coinage in many cities throughout the Hellenistic world, including Alexandria and the Ptolemaic kingdom. The main coin in circulation during this period was the tetradrachm, which weighed 17.2 grams and was valued at 4 drachmas. They became widely used throughout the Hellenistic world for several reasons, including their durability, high value, and intricate artistic designs. Having been first struck under Alexander the Great, many rulers of the kingdoms that succeeded his empire often depicted themselves on the coins, with both portraits and inscriptions alongside their former king. The widespread adoption of the Attic standard facilitated both domestic and foreign trade, ultimately playing a prominent role in the significant increase in commerce witnessed during the Hellenistic period. It truly felt like Greece and the wider world was on the verge of entering into another golden era. This period of affluence and growing wealth would be cut short, however, as political instability and rising tensions would soon plunge the Hellenistic kingdoms into war once again. In hopes of gaining independence from Macedonian control, new powers emerged in Greece, such as the Achaean and Aetolian leagues. Each comprised numerous city-states who joined together in times of war, but each remained an autonomous region. As this occurred throughout the traditional heartland of Greece, the Hellenistic kingdoms found themselves in a period of prolonged stability. However, territorial claims between the Ptolemaic dynasties of Egypt and the Seleucid Empire of Asia remained a constant cause for concern at the start of the 3rd century BC. One such region was Syria, which both kingdoms desired to control due to its strategic importance. It essentially served as a corridor that facilitated not only the movement of trade between Asia and Egypt, but also, in times of war, the movement of military forces between distant lands. Despite Syria initially falling under the dominion of Ptolemy I, it was later claimed by Seleucus I after the mighty king founded his empire in 312 BC. As the Ptolemaic kingdom and Seleucid Empire continued to expand, tensions between their leaders rose to new heights, and by 274 BC, they found themselves in the middle of a series of military confrontations known as the Syrian Wars. Lasting for over a century, 6 major conflicts occurred, as the Hellenistic kingdoms sought to exert their dominion over contested territories. The First Syrian War lasted for 3 years and saw Ptolemy II mobilize a large number of troops to reclaim parts of southern Anatolia and coastal Syria that had been previously lost to Antiochus I, the Seleucid king. The war proved Ptolemy was both a skilled general and a forceful ruler. Following his triumph over his eastern rivals, things calmed down for a few decades. However, with the accession of Antiochus II to the Seleucid throne in 261 BC, conflict was once again on the horizon. He immediately set out to regain the territories lost by his father. Having made a pact with Antigonus II Gonatus, the king of Macedon, their kingdoms shared a common goal of removing any influence Ptolemy II had over the Aegean. Much of the initial history surrounding the war has been lost to time. However, we know Antigonus's naval fleet decimated Ptolemy's during the Battle of Kos in 261 BC. The Ptolemaic kingdom lost considerable ground in Ionia and Cilicia, and Antigonus brought Miletus and Ephesus under his control. By 253 BC, the war was at its end, and both kingdoms struggled with internal strife. So, to achieve peace, a settlement was involved, which saw the marriage of Antiochus to one of Ptolemy's daughters, Berenice Syra. Both Antiochus and Ptolemy would pass away in 246, and with their passing, another war would emerge. In the wake of the death of the Seleucid king, 2 of his wives sought to place their children on the throne. Antiochus's former wife, Laodice, claimed her son was the heir to the empire, but Ptolemy II's daughter, Berenice Syra, claimed that her newborn son was the legitimate heir. She called for her brother, Ptolemy III, the new king of the Ptolemaic kingdom, to travel to the city of Antioch and assist her. But by the time he arrived, his sister and her child had been murdered. Greatly angered by this betrayal, he declared war on Seleucus II, who had taken the throne. Lasting from 246 to 241 BC, Ptolemy defeated the Seleucid king's forces on several occasions, earning reputable victories in Syria and Anatolia. Realizing he could not defeat Ptolemy, Seleucus opted for peace in 241 BC, offering his rival various territories on Syria's northern coast, including Seleucia Pieria, the lucrative port of Antioch. With this, Ptolemy III had elevated his kingdom to unprecedented heights. Reaching its greatest influence, the Hellenistic world once again found stability and remained relatively at ease for 2 decades. But then rose Antiochus III the Great, who ascended to the Seleucid throne in 233 BC. Motivated to return his empire to its glory days, he immediately established control over Persia and the Media, both of which had been in a state of rebellion. Following this, he turned his eyes to Syria and Egypt. By 219 BC, Ptolemy IV Philopator had taken over the reins of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Yet he was plagued with internal turmoil. This allowed Antiochus to recapture Tyre and Seleucia Pieria, but he refrained from invading Egypt and listened to diplomatic proposals from Ptolemaic officials. However, what he was not aware of was that Ptolemy's minister had been recruiting individuals from both Greece and Egypt to serve in his army. By 217 BC, his forces engaged Antiochus at the Battle of Raphia, close to modern Gaza. It was the largest battle in over 80 years and resulted in a victory for Ptolemy. This allowed the Ptolemaic monarch to maintain control over Syria and brought an end to the Fourth Syrian War. By 202 BC, Antiochus III sought to capitalize on the political instability in Egypt that followed the death of Ptolemy IV. Forming an alliance with Philip V of Macedon, their joint forces invaded Syria, and this time, the Seleucid Empire emerged victorious, following a prominent victory at Panium, a short distance from Mount Hermon in 200 BC. Struggling with revolts throughout Egypt, Ptolemy V was forced to sign a treaty, handing over full control of Syria to Antiochus, while also agreeing to marry his daughter, Cleopatra I. 8 decades of prolonged conflicts had taken their toll on the Hellenistic world. As the swords and shields of these dynasties clashed on the battlefield, the overall strength of their kingdoms were weakened with each conflict. This allowed for the emergence of a new superpower, originating from an Italian settlement near the river Tiber. This was the rise of the Roman Republic. Throughout the Syrian wars, the Romans had been slowly conquering neighboring nations and expanding their influence throughout mainland Greece and Asia Minor. So, when the Sixth Syrian War commenced, around 170 BC, Antiochus IV faced intervention from Rome when he tried to besiege Alexandria 2 years later. The Egyptians had previously called upon the Roman Senate to help them, and in return, they dispatched the general Gaius Popilius Laenas. Despite being friends with Antiochus, he offered him an ultimatum: remove the Seleucid forces from Egypt and Cyprus, or face the wrath of Rome. The Romans considered Egypt a valuable ally, as they imported a large amount of grain used to feed their extensive army. Having heard the stories of his father's devastating losses during the Seleucid-Roman Wars at the beginning of the 2nd century, Antiochus ultimately decided to leave Egypt behind and return home, thus marking the end of the 6th and final Syrian War. An inauspicious shadow cast by the banner of an eagle loomed over the Hellenistic world, and soon it would change the course of history. As the Hellenistic kingdoms had expanded their resources throughout the century-long Syrian wars, the Roman Republic's strength and influence had grown steadily, yet inexorably. According to legends, Rome was founded as a small Italic settlement on the banks of the river Tiber by the semi-mythical brothers Romulus and Remus. By the end of the 6th century BC, it had transitioned from a monarchy to a republic after overthrowing the last Etruscan king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. In the centuries that followed, its power and influence grew dramatically, and it began to exert its dominance over the Mediterranean regions. By the end of the Syrian Wars in 168 BC, Hellenistic kingdoms had already tasted defeat at the hands of Rome on several occasions. The Antigonid dynasty of Macedon suffered a defeat at the hands of the Republic during the Second Macedonian War from 200 to 197 BC. However, while Macedonia lost its territories outside the kingdom, its monarchy was permitted to continue ruling, albeit under Roman influence. The Seleucid Empire had also faced Rome's wrath during the Aetolian War at the beginning of the 2nd century BC. Both Hellenistic kingdoms kept a level of autonomy, but now they were forced to pay tributes in one way or another. However, for the minor kingdoms that fell under Roman influence, they were expected to abide by the heavy taxation system. This required subjugated populations, including the Greek city-states and Macedon, to pay tribute to the Republic. This often came in the form of tributum soli, or land taxes, and tributum capitis, or poll taxes. The Romans used the collected taxes to fund their ongoing military campaigns, state activities, and various public projects. But more often than not, giving away vast amounts of wealth to foreign leaders didn't sit well with the native peoples, and was often met with great resistance. The financial burden felt across the heartland of Greece would eventually lead many of the city-states to join Macedon in an uprising that would become known as the Third Macedonian War. Following his father's death in 179 BC, Perseus of Macedon succeeded him to the throne. Unlike his father, who had maintained a diplomatic relationship with Rome, he adopted an aggressive stance and sought to oust the Republic's influence in Greece. To do so, he sought alliances with several Greek city-states. He claimed he would not only restore Macedon to its former glory, but promised reforms that would ensure citizens experienced a better life. By 172 BC, Perseus was visited by a Roman commission that sought to relieve Macedonia of its autonomy, which greatly angered Perseus, who immediately refused the demands. Taking this as a sign of hostility, Roman officials prepared for military action, and they declared war on Macedonia. Over the next 3 years, both sides clashed on the battlefield, with each experiencing some level of success. But the turning point came on June 22nd, 168 BC, at the Battle of Pydna, under the command of the Reverend General Lucius Aemilius Paulus. The Roman army decimated Persia's forces on the battlefield. On this fateful day, the feared Macedonian phalanx formation that had won the kingdom many wars was outmatched by the tactics of Aemilius Paulus. He drew the opposing forces into uneven terrain, thereby rendering their dangerous formation ineffective. From here, the Roman soldiers cut down the Macedonians one by one, until over 20,000 were either slain or captured. This devastating loss marked the end of their independence. Following their victory, Rome divided Macedonia into 4 client republics, closely governed by Roman officials. King Perseus was captured and forced to spend the rest of his life in prison, marking the end of the Antigonid dynasty, which had ruled Macedonia for centuries. What might have seemed an incalculable loss for the former Hellenistic kingdom was only the tip of the iceberg, as the change that would ensue across Greece in the decades to come would forever change the course of history. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, increasing tensions between the Roman Republic and the Delian League, made up of Greek polis, had risen to new heights. Seeking to push back against increasing Roman influence, which had only intensified following the latter's subjugation of Macedon, these city-states began to rebel openly. The no-nonsense attitude of the Republic took this as a direct threat, and once again began mobilizing a large number of troops, resulting in the Achaean War. Under the command of the strategos Critolaus, the Greek city-states joined in arms to push back against Roman imperialism. They found success in the early days of the conflict, defeating a Roman army under the watch of Quintus Caecilius Metellus Macedonicus at Scarphaea, but in time they would face a fate similar to the Macedonians. By 146 BC, the Roman Senate dispatched Lucius Mummius with an enormous army to attack the city of Corinth. Looking upon the heart of the Achaean resistance, over 26,000 Roman soldiers arrived at the gates of the city during the summer months. They immediately got to work besieging the city, but despite being vastly outnumbered, the defenders of Corinth showed great courage under the new strategos Dias. But by Easter, the Roman forces breached the walls and ruthlessly sacked the city. They slaughtered every male and enslaved the women and children. Houses were burned to the ground, and temples looted, with the goods being taken back to Rome. The obliteration of the fabled city served as a stark reminder to the rest of the Greek polis: rebel and die. In the aftermath of the disastrous loss, the Romans dissolved the Greek political leagues. With this, the conquest of Greece was complete, and the peninsula was under total Roman control. Despite this, several city-states, including Athens and Sparta, maintained a degree of independence. Nonetheless, this event marked a cultural shift in Hellas, one that would see a mixing of cultures as Rome continued to exert its dominance over the predominantly autonomous Greek city-states. Copious amounts of Greek literature, art, and philosophy were shared throughout the Roman world as a direct consequence of the military conquests during the 2nd century BC. The Romans adopted various Greek styles, including the beautifully designed Doric and Ionic columns in many of their buildings, whereas the writings of earlier Greeks heavily influenced Roman scholars and poets, and by the tail end of the Republic, most educated Romans were bilingual, speaking both Latin and Greek. This is evident in prominent figures like Scipio Africanus, who is said to have frequently conversed with his contemporaries in Greece. The deeply profound philosophy that sat at the heart of Greece throughout the centuries also permeated Rome. Republican statesmen became infatuated with Stoicism, who looked at its core beliefs of self-control and virtue as invaluable characteristics. However, one aspect of cultural adoption that went beyond the others was the incorporation of numerous Greek deities into the Roman pantheon. While they had their own gods, the Romans saw parallels between their deities and those of the Greeks. So instead of outright replacing their deities with Greek alternatives, we see a blending of two traditions. This resulted in Zeus becoming Jupiter, Poseidon becoming Neptune, and Aphrodite becoming Venus. The widely revered Greek deity, Dionysus, or Bacchus to the Romans, was widespread as he embodied several concepts that directly resonated with their culture, including inspiration, the love of wine, and the potential for madness. This would eventually lead to what's known as the Greco-Roman culture, a foundation paving the way for what we would come to know as Western civilization. As this blending of cultures continued throughout the Greco-Roman world, the Republic continued to expand its reach across the Mediterranean. By 63 BC, the Roman Empire had annexed what remained of the once mighty Seleucid Empire, which by this point in history was a shell of its former self, due to a prolonged period of internal decay. This marked the second of the great Hellenistic kingdoms now under their control. But by the middle of the 1st century BC, it hadn't yet conquered Ptolemaic Egypt, which remained a significant power in the region. But this all changed under the infamous reign of Queen Cleopatra VII. She ascended the throne in 51 BC and immediately got to work, forming alliances with Roman leaders such as Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. While these relationships were meant to protect Egypt from external threats, they would ultimately play a pivotal role in the kingdom's downfall. Cleopatra's rule occurred during a period of instability that plunged Rome into civil war. Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus found themselves at either end of the conflict, vying for control of the Republic. Caesar bested Pompey in several battles, ultimately forcing the latter to seek refuge in Egypt. But on September 28th, 48 BC, Pompey was assassinated. Caesar would later return to Rome and accept the position of Dictator Perpetuo, or Dictator for Life, in 45 BC, but he was assassinated less than a year later. This is when things started to go seriously wrong for the Ptolemaic kingdoms. Caesar had previously supported Cleopatra's claim to the throne, and following his death, she sought an alliance with Mark Antony, his once fabled general. But this further entwined her kingdom with the politics of the Roman world. In hopes of solidifying her position once again, she had 3 children with Antony, aimed at consolidating power over Egypt and halting claims made by Caesar's adopted son, Octavian. But it would be to no avail. By 31 BC, the Egyptian power couple suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Actium, a significant naval battle in which Octavian's forces decimated their fleet. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria in hopes of evading the Roman army. But the following year, they found themselves boxed in, and instead of facing capture and, most likely, an unfair trial, both decided to commit suicide. Cleopatra's death marked the end of the last Hellenistic kingdom, and Egypt was subsequently annexed, becoming a Roman province. This allowed the Republic to gain control over Egypt's cherished resources, including grain. But more importantly, it marked a turning point in history. Rome was now the leading superpower throughout the Mediterranean, encompassing the vast majority of the territory once held by Alexander the Great and his Greco-Macedonian generals. This marks the end of the Hellenistic period and the ushering in of a new era for Greece, one in which the autonomy and independence enjoyed by the city-states for centuries was no more. Now they would fall subject to the mighty Roman Empire. You can now explore our maps in even more detail as prints and downloads. Premium historical maps designed by historians. Link below.